He wasn't speaking English. He was speaking Aramaic. Now, I don't know, he may have spoke English. Maybe his accent was real strong, so he preferred speaking Aramaic. But he was speaking Aramaic, and the words, blessed are, that he used in Aramaic should not have been translated like that. And many of you who have taken these classes with Ellen Bush realize what he actually said are ripe are.
What?
Ripe, R-I-P-E, ripe are the people.
Okay.
Why ripe are? He's talking about the same thing that happens, of course, with other growing things, with fruits and vegetables. They become ripe, if you will, for harvest. One of the interesting things, our son Benjamin, as some of you know, became very knowledgeable about wine. And he told us that in Europe, they tend to pick the grapes earlier. In the United States, they pick them later. It gives them a different flavor to European wines than to wines here. They're both ripe, but they're at different stages of being ripe. And that's something to know about. Ripe is not something that one moment you're not and the next moment you are. You know, if you're talking about fruit, you don't stand there watching it and all of a sudden, bing, it's ripe. It wasn't ripe a minute ago. Ripe is a developmental process. And it is for us too, spiritually. And so we're all at different ripeness within our spiritual growth, as it should be. And that's why there isn't just one thing you can say, that's spiritual wisdom. An example of that, again, let me use the Tao Te Ching. I'll paraphrase it. There are several different translations, but I'll paraphrase it. It says, the sage, the wise person, does not fear the claw of the tiger or the horn of the water buffalo or the spear of the soldier, because they are so complete that there is no room for these things to enter them. A great spiritual wisdom. I suspect many of us wouldn't feel very comfortable getting in a cage with a tiger. Because maybe we're not at that spiritual level yet to not fear the claws of the tiger. But there's degrees of that spiritual wisdom. There's the idea of don't live in fear. Because most of the things we fear and we worry about are never going to happen to us. And so we can destroy ourselves with fear for things that are never going to happen. So you see, that's the same concept of not being in fear, but at different levels. And this is what spiritual wisdom is to me. It's taking a look at these universal truths and putting them in the part that, in a way, in looking at them in the way that's going to work for each one of us. And with that, let me give you a couple of ideas that I think are some of the basics of spiritual truth to move us forward. One of those, when I told Stephen I wasn't going to talk about Christmas, he said, well, are you going to talk about the winter solstice? Because it's almost here too. And I wasn't, but I said, well, if Stephen wants me to, surely I should. So one of the spiritual wisdoms is the cyclic nature of reality. So we have the winter solstice coming up. Part of that cycle with the summer solstice, with the equinox, the cycle of the seasons, which shows us, along with the cycle of day and night, that nature is cyclic. We have that in biology as well. We all know that living things, they're born, they grow, they reproduce in some way, whether that's seeds or eggs or babies. They continue growing until they pass on from this life. And then these seeds or eggs or babies continue growing, and the cycle goes on and on and on. And it's a spiritual truth. And Joanne, you made a reference to this earlier, that with our mind, we can create our lives. And those lives that we create affect our spiritual development. And as they affect our spiritual development, we recreate our lives, which then affect our spiritual development. And spirituality is a cyclic aspect of creation. And when you talk about the creative ability, that reminds me then of another. I'm going to give one other example of a spiritual wisdom, the wisdom behind the way things work. Famous scientist Niels Bohr made up a word to refer to it: complementarity.
What?
An idea that I've talked about before here. He says that there are solutions in nature, or in effect, states of being that are mutually exclusive. And we've talked about that before, that everything exists as both energies of waves, wave energy, and as particles, pieces of particles. These are mutually exclusive. By definition, if you are one, you are not the other. And yet, time after time, it's been proven that everything exists in both states. And so he says the very universe, the foundation of it, is complementary, mutually exclusive answers that are both correct. And we see that in art. I mean, one of the sayings we all know is, beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. Many of us consider a foundation of the universe as beauty. And yet, the definitions of it are radically different. We might look at what makes a beautiful woman. And in another culture, unless you have plates in your lips that will extend them out several inches, you could not be considered beautiful. Beauty is in the eyes of the beholder, which tells us, again, that there are mutually exclusive ideas within art that are all the same. And it's a foundation of spirituality. And we know that in many ways. We know it in all of our concepts of oneness and how we all come together on things, that the realities that seem different are really one. But I want to say it in a little different way and leave you with this. A statement by the philosopher, poet, William Blake, to describe how the whole universe is really everything, and we can make it what we want it to be. And he said, to see the world in a grain of sand, and heaven in a wildflower, to hold infinity in the palms of our hand, and eternity in an hour.